What's going on, guys? This is Rob. If you guys enjoy my content, make sure you hit the subscribe button and make sure you hit that little bell so you never miss out on my sexy voice. Okay, so we are in kind of a weird spot. We have about 6 weeks until we need to upload the Return of Thanos after his second death, which goes directly into the prelude to Thanos Quest, which goes directly into Infinity Gauntlet. Yes, I have Infinity Gauntlet Part 8. Yes, I have Thanos Quest Parts 1 and 2. I originally had to take them down for copyright reasons, but that's since been sorted out. So at this point, I'm just waiting to re-upload those, which means that we kind of have like 6 weeks to kill. And so what we're gonna do is we're gonna upload Earth X. We're gonna do the Earth X series now, or at least just the Earth X story. I'm gonna test this. I want to see how you guys respond to it, because I don't know if people will really enjoy it, or if there's only like a small handful of people that are really even like remotely interested in it. But Earth X is really, really good. Earth X is actually the story that basically deals with the answer to the question, what would happen if everybody on Earth had superpowers? What would happen to the Marvel Universe? And how would the heroes deal with it? And so it's basically a dystopian future story. And it's actually really, really interesting. Now, there is a prelude in terms of how all this took place and what all happened. In terms of how everyone gained powers, all that kind of stuff, we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. For right now, I'm not going to cover the prelude. I'm going to do that at the end. I'm going to make you guys wait. But what this initially does is this picks up with Captain America Steve Rogers. And this basically tells the origin story of his character. And that's something that I want you guys to notice. With this Earth X, the way this initially picks up is the origin stories for the characters are largely the same. They're largely the kind of stories we're familiar with. There's small changes here and there, but largely for the most part, the origin stories are still the same. For example, Steve Rogers took the super soldier serum and became Captain America. He eventually went on to fight against the Red Skull during World War II and the various, German powers and so on and so forth. And then what we ended up having was the drone plane explosion. Now here's a big difference between Earth X and the main Marvel Universe when it comes to the drone plane explosion. The way this originally happened, this was done by Baron Zemo, but there's nothing to indicate that Baron Zemo is actually here. We're kind of left to believe he is, but it's really one of those things where it's traced back to the Red Skull. And so because of that, we can largely just kind of assume the Red Skull was behind the whole thing, which he kind of was when it came to the original drone plane crash. The difference here is that in the original crash, Captain America fell down into the ocean. He was basically, frozen in ice for however many years. And then Bucky Barnes survived the explosion and was captured by the Russians and turned into the Winter Soldier. In this story, the indication is that didn't happen. Bucky Barnes died. He's gone. He's no longer part of the equation here. Now, following this, what ended up happening is we basically had Captain America who came back, the Red Skull, of course, who rose to prominence once again. We had the story where the Red Skull gained a cosmic cube. The difference of what's not necessarily covered directly in this, instead it's actually covered in the backup pages. It's kind of like an exchange between the two characters who are chronicling this whole thing. What we ended up finding out is that Captain America somewhere along the line killed the Red Skull. And so the Red Skull's basically dead, or at least that's the indication. And so what it does is kind of jump to the modern day. Now again, this story is kind of being given to us by two individuals, and I'll reveal who those are once we get to the end of this whole thing. But what we end up doing here is picking up with like the return of the Inhumans. And the Inhumans had basically left Earth for reasons that we'll find out later on in this story. But the Inhumans showing back up really comes by way of the royal marriage between Luna and the Prince. Now, Luna is the daughter of Crystal and Quicksilver. If you don't know who Crystal is, not a great big huge deal. She's basically just a member of the Inhuman royal family. And then of course, Quicksilver, the son of Magneto. In Marvel Comics, in the main Marvel universe, they did have a child named Luna. What this story does is take place around 20 years in the future or so, and basically say, we end up having the Inhumans making their return in order to kind of, engage in this royal marriage. The problem is that when the Inhumans show back up, everything's really gone to pot. Attilan's just kind of left in shambles, and no one really knows where like superpowered people are. At least they don't know where superpowered people are, where like the Avengers or the X-Men or any of those folks are at. And so what they end up doing is taking up residence and traveling directly to New York in order to figure out what's going on. And so what we do is we basically join up with what seems to be just a city of New York that's just filled with all these superpowered beings. But what's happening here is there's kind of a reshaping of things taking place to a degree, in the sense that what you have is this kind of Hydra alien. Now, this is one of those weird scenarios, because in the main Marvel universe, Hydra basically broke off from the Germans. It was founded by Baron von Strucker. His ideologies were starkly different from the Germans, and that's one of the reasons why he became an enemy of that group, at the same time allying himself with the Hand, and then just kind of going off and doing his own thing. Because of this, in Earth X, there really is no Hydra in the sense that we're familiar with Baron von Strucker. Instead, there's just kind of like the Hydra organism. And what this thing has done is somewhere along the line begun bonding itself to various people, one of the most notable being Jennifer Walters' She-Hulk. And what it does is it basically kind of takes over people people in their entirety and brings them into kind of hive mind collective, much like the actual like Hydra organization itself. Something else to notice here is that Steve Rogers, as we see him, is vastly different than the Captain America that we're used to. One of the things that had taken place here is that when Steve Rogers is basically being Captain America, the country had rallied under him. Now, much like in the main Marvel universe, in Captain America number 250, I think, Steve Rogers ran for president of the United States, or at the very least, was offered the opportunity to run for president of the United States. The difference is that unlike the main Marvel universe where he ran, in this story, he doesn't run. He actually rejects the whole thing. And the issue with this is that the American people see him as rejecting America. And so as a result, Captain America loses popularity. And that's one of the reasons why his outfit's so tattered. He looks kind of like, like he's a man that's just struggled over and over and over again. He's really seen some things. Not only that, we end up finding out that he's not necessarily paired up with Falcon. Instead, Falcon had actually been absorbed into this Hydra organism, whatever it is. Instead, he's paired up with Wyatt Wingfoot. Now, Wyatt Wingfoot is a character that dates all the way back to the early days of the Fantastic Four. So if you haven't heard about him, don't feel bad, because in truth, he hasn't been a relevant character for something like 50 years. But Wyatt Wingfoot was basically kind of like a mascot for the Fantastic Four to a degree. He was a close friend. He would help them on missions, different things like that, but he had no real powers. He was just kind of a guy who was there. And so the idea is that he basically becomes Red Wing, at least that's the name that's given to him. He kind of becomes the new Falcon. And so that's what's pretty insane here, because we end up having the actual Falcon basically speaking to Captain America by way of this, Hydra entity, saying, hey, look, you have to join us. You should show up. You should become part of our group. And where Captain America and Wyatt kind of fight against these forces, their group is suddenly met with the arrival of Cyclops. And this is an older Cyclops. I mean, he's older, he's grayed, he's not part of the X-Men. As far as we're aware, the X-Men don't really seem to exist. Instead, what we're told is that somewhere along the line, the X-Men had effectively disbanded and Charles Xavier had died. And so the group's not really there anymore. Following that, we switch over to Peter Parker. And Peter Parker, again, kind of a guy who's in his 40s, basically an aging guy, is told by Sergeant Luke Cage, hey, look, you have to get out of here. Tony Stark is implementing one of these purges. Of course, you also have May Parker, who's kind of watching the events unfold wearing the actual spider outfit. But that's when we end up finding out here that this attempt by the Hydra entity to basically infiltrate New York and conquer the city in its entirety is a repeating pattern. It seems to happen almost every single day. And every single day, Tony Stark sends out these life model decoy Avengers, and they go through and they quote unquote purge, this Hydra entity, and basically run it out of town until it comes back and tries to repeat the same process again. But that's the nature of things, because what we end up having is Steve Rogers, who is basically able to break away a piece of the clothing of one of the individuals who've been brought in by this Hydra entity, and Steve Rogers reveals that what's on this this cloth is a Red Skull insignia. Now, this is where things really begin to get crazy. What we end up doing here is actually following up with these two individuals who are chronicling the Fantastic Four. Now, the Fantastic Four origin is exactly the way that it always was. The idea that Reed Richards was more obsessed with like the pursuit of knowledge, different things like that, which led him taking Ben Grimm and Susan Storm and Johnny Storm onto a spacecraft. They flew into space. They were bombarded by cosmic rays and they gained their powers. The difference here is that somewhere along the line, Reed Richards had basically discovered the nature of vibranium, in the sense that when he was presumably invited by Black Panther to Wakanda, and Reed sort of deduced that vibranium was extraterrestrial in nature. And so what he began doing was kind of setting up these transportation tubes that were designed to basically eliminate the entire need for energy across the world using vibranium as a source. And that's really all we get, because what we end up doing is picking up with the Inhumans when they basically travel to Yancey Street, to where Ben Grimm's located at, of course, with Adam Warlock and Kismet, rather, who are essentially just kind of leaving the house of Ben Grimm. Those of you guys who don't know, you saw Kismet in Guardians of the Galaxy 2. That was the chick who was like, the leader of whatever that group was, who was all gold. The whole basis behind this was, when we talked about Adam Warlock before, we kind of revealed the idea that Adam Warlock was created by a group called the Hive, who were basically hell-bent on creating like the perfect being. And where Adam Warlock essentially made his escape, turned against the Hive, took off, for parts unknown, and then, his whole story unfolded in terms of his, inclusion with Thanos and different things like that. That what was also created was a being called Her, which basically became Kismet. And they were designed to be mates. And so what this does is essentially reveal that the two of them have found one another and they have effectively become mates. Not only that, what we end up doing is picking up with Ben Grimm and his family. Now, the cool thing about this is that Ben Grimm is married to Alicia Masters, and Alicia Masters has basically gained powers, which is to say the ability to bring things to life. Now, this is important because Alicia Masters was originally a woman who was blind, but was a gifted sculptor. And what this meant was that she could basically sculpt anything. She could make, things look almost real life, and then in turn, with the power she has now, bring them to life. And that's how the family of Ben Grimm basically comes to fruition. The actions of Alicia Masters allows her to take the clay and then mold it into like children basically of Ben Grimm and herself and then bring them to life. All these different artifacts, these things that you see here, the moldings of Spider-Man, the moldings of Captain America, the moldings of Doctor Doom's head, all that's done by Alicia Masters. And it's pretty cool because while they're all sitting down around the dinner table, the question that comes from the Inhumans is, where are the Fantastic Four? What in the world's going on here? Well, what we end up finding out is that somewhere along the line during this 20-year window, Doctor Doom had essentially launched a campaign due to the fact that there was a huge meeting between the United Nations, and it was Doctor Doom's attempt to effectively capture the world's food resources, to essentially say, if you control resources, you control the world. And Doctor Doom had actually brought Namor the Submariner to his side by arguing that when humanity takes into account what they're going to do with this global food shortage, at no point will they take into account Atlantis. Instead, they will think only about what benefits the surface world. And so he effectively joined Doctor Doom in order to curtail that whole discussion in the first place. And so as a result, the Fantastic Four responded, Captain America responded, so on and so forth, and it led into a pretty significant battle between the two groups. But where Johnny Storm went to try to stop Namor the Submariner, Namor basically killed him. He stabbed him with his trident. And in response, Franklin Richards freaked out. He basically used his powers of reality warping to condemn Namor the Submariner to burn on one half of his body for all eternity. The only way for him to basically not burn on one half is to jump down into the oceans. And that's kind of where it keeps him at the moment. It keeps him underwater so that he's not literally burning on one side. But because of the fact that Susan Storm and Johnny Storm were so close as brother and sister, Susan Storm loses it as well. And so what ends up happening is she chases after Doctor Doom, immediately goes after him. He leads her into a trap and then detonates the entire facility, killing Doctor Doom himself and Susan Storm. And so all that's really left here is Franklin Richards. We're given no indication Valeria Richards, the daughter of Reed and Susan, is actually alive. And instead, all we have is just Ben Grimm and Reed. And that's where things begin to get kind of crazy because the question is asked, well, then whatever happened to Reed Richards? You know, where in the world is Reed Richards at? And so what we end up learning here is that Reed Richards, in his attempt to kind of deal with the gravity of the situation, but to also use the almost limitless resources of Victor Von Doom based out of Latveria, he basically took on Doom's armor and then took up residence in Latveria. And so Reed Richards basically became Doctor Doom. And it's really cool. It's such an awesome idea. It's such an awesome concept. But Reed is really overcome with the whole situation. It's just kind of sitting there and almost on the verge of giving up because what he does is speak with Tony Stark day after day in terms of trying to find a way to figure out what went on with regards to everybody gaining powers, how everybody got abilities in the first place. All they know is it has something to do with the overload of vibranium, but nobody really knows how. They simply know that Reed built this massive system, that vibranium was used as a conduit, basically as an energy source, that somehow it overloaded, something went wrong, and everybody gained powers across the world. And so the idea of Reed is, really to kind of like find a cure. It's to find a way to fix this. But notice this whole thing, and this is something that I want you guys to keep in mind. Notice this. When it comes to this whole scenario, it's superheroes trying to return things to the status quo. Well, the world was better when only we had powers. The world was not better when everyone had powers. It's one of those interesting things. It's kind of like a fear of change in terms of how that whole thing happens. And so it is cool. The issue is that Reed's been trying to figure it out all this time, but hasn't come to a conclusion. He's just kind of stuck in this rut of dealing with this emotional crushing, the fact that he lost Susan Storm, the fact that he lost Johnny Storm, the fact that Ben Grimm kind of abandoned the Fantastic Four ideology, went off, started his own family, and kind of left it all behind. That's really where all this is kind of coming from for the character of Reed. And so what we end up doing is switching over to this sort of carnival that's going on. In terms of this group, can you see, do you want to come see the new Daredevil? Can you kill the new Daredevil? That's really the whole idea. And they subject him to a wide array of different forms of torture, whether it's fire, something along those lines. And this guy survives each and every time. And so the result is that where he's supposed to basically be set on fire and then impaled, and that's really supposed to be about it. Instead, the entire scenario is met by this like massive amount of people who all show up at the same time. A lot of these like superheroes who just kind of pop up onto the scene and basically say, hey, look, you guys are all under the control of the Red Skull now. This all belongs to us. Everything belongs to the Skull. Either you can ally with this or you can die. That's really the only ultimatum that's given to them. But again, it's crazy. So a couple things that I want to kind of wrap into this. A couple things that I want to discuss about this for a second. The first is the state of government. So the United States government in this story has effectively collapsed. There's no more Congress. There's no more White House. There's basically Norman Osborn, who's essentially president. He has absolute power and everything's basically run by corporations. It's really run by like Norman Osborn himself. And so if it doesn't have a financial incentive, then no one cares. None of the corporations care, And so again, it's pretty wild in terms of how this whole thing unfolds. The story only ever gets better from here. It gets absolutely bonkers. Oh my God. And then you get into Universe X, and then you get into Paradise X. Dude, I loved, like, I think Earth X is the best of them, but like Universe X is actually pretty solid. Like it's pretty, oh dude, wait till you guys get to the Galactus reveal. Oh man, dude, you guys are gonna freak out. When we get to the reveal of Galactus at the end of the story, dude, okay, for those of you guys who read that, when I saw that, I was like, oh my God, Gordon, do not show people who Galactus is in Earth X. If I see a Galactus panel pop up on here, man, you're gonna be in a world of hurt. Like I'm really excited to see the Galactus reveal. Dude, I'm actually excited to read the comments on the Galactus reveal. But anyway, guys, we're gonna go ahead and bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.